The first time the ground trembled beneath Armand's feet, he thought it was another freight train passing beyond the ridge, the same dull thunder that rolled through the outskirts of the city every evening. But this vibration was different, deeper, like something alive pressing its weight into the bones of the earth itself. And when the birds erupted from the tree line in a chaotic black cloud, he knew before he saw it that the old stories whispered by his grandfather had never truly been stories at all, because beyond the rusted fence, where the modern world thinned into raw wilderness, a shape moved between the trees, massive and deliberate, its presence bending the air with a silent authority that machines could never imitate. And then it stepped into the clearing, and time seemed to collapse inward as the creature revealed itself fully, its colossal head swaying with measured precision, amber eyes scanning with an intelligence that was not human but disturbingly aware, its skin a tapestry of scars and hardened scales that shimmered faintly under the late afternoon sun, and its breath, visible even in the warm air, escaped in slow, controlled bursts as though it understood restraint, as though it knew the fragile world it now inhabited was not built for something like it, yet had adapted anyway. Because this was no anomaly, no isolated beast lost in time. This was the reality humanity had grown alongside for generations, a reality where cities were built with reinforced perimeters, where highways curved around ancient migration paths, where the roar of a Tyrannosaurus rex was as familiar as thunder, a sound that could freeze entire districts into silence in an instant. And Armand stood there, motionless, as the giant predator lowered its head toward the cracked asphalt, sniffing, sensing, calculating, its tail shifting slowly behind it like a counterweight to its immense presence. And for a brief, fragile moment, their eyes met, human and prehistoric, separated by millions of years of evolution, yet bound by the same shared present. And he felt something ancient awaken in his chest, not just fear, but recognition, a primal understanding that this world had never belonged to one species alone, that survival had always been a negotiation between the small and the immense, the fast and the unstoppable. And when the Rex finally exhaled and turned away, disappearing back into the forest with a series of earth-shaking steps, Armand realized that what terrified humanity most was not the size of these creatures, nor their strength, but their quiet acceptance of coexistence, because they did not hunt indiscriminately. They did not destroy without reason. They simply existed with a certainty that made human dominance feel like a temporary illusion. And as the forest swallowed the last trace of its presence, the city behind him slowly breathed again, distant engines restarting, voices rising in cautious relief. But Armand remained still, staring into the shadows where the ancient giant had vanished, knowing that somewhere beyond those trees, entire ecosystems thrived under the watchful movements of creatures that had never left, creatures that had shaped rivers, forests, and even the architecture of human civilization itself. And for the first time in his life, he did not feel like a resident of a modern world, but a guest in something far older, something that had been here long before the first brick was laid, and would remain long after the last one crumbled. And as the sun dipped lower, casting long golden beams across the broken ground, he turned back toward the city with a quiet, unshakable understanding that the balance between humanity and the giants beyond the fence was not maintained by control or power, but by an unspoken agreement written in instinct and respect, a balance that could tip at any moment, not with violence, but with a single decision from a creature whose footsteps could rewrite the shape of the land itself. And in that fragile equilibrium, the true story of their shared world continued to unfold. By the time Armand returned to the city gates, the evening sirens had already begun their low, pulsing hum, a sound designed not to alarm but to remind. a ritual woven into daily life ever since the outer districts were mapped according to the movement of the great herds and solitary hunters that roamed beyond. And the guards at the reinforced checkpoint barely looked up as he passed through, their attention fixed on the distant tree line, where motion sensors flickered across a holographic display, each blinking signal marking something vast and alive, moving through the fading light. And inside the perimeter, life resumed its fragile imitation of normality as vendors reopened their stalls, neon signs flickered back to life, and the distant rumble of generators blended with the constant awareness that beyond steel and concrete, something older and immeasurably more powerful continued its slow, patient existence. And Armand moved through the streets with a mind that refused to settle, his thoughts pulled back again and again to that moment in the clearing, to the way the wrecks had looked at him, not as prey, not as an enemy, but as something insignificant yet acknowledged, like a passing shadow that posed no threat. And that realization unsettled him more than any display of aggression could have, because it meant that humanity's survival was not secured by dominance, but by irrelevance in the eyes of creatures that could end it if they chose. And as he reached his apartment high above the ground, he stepped onto the narrow balcony overlooking the city's edge, where the skyline abruptly gave way to darkness. And there, just beyond the final row of floodlights, the forest stretched endlessly, a living ocean of movement and sound that never truly slept. And as night settled fully, the first distant call echoed through the air, a deep, resonant roar that rolled across the landscape like a wave, answered moments later by another, farther away, then another, until the entire horizon seemed to vibrate with a language humanity could hear but never understand, a network of communication that bound creatures across miles of wilderness in ways no human system ever could. And Armand leaned against the cold railing, listening, feeling that same ancient recognition stir within him again, stronger now, as if something in those calls reached into a part of him untouched by modern life, something instinctual and buried. And he wondered, not for the first time, what the world would look like if the balance shifted, if the invisible boundary between city and wild dissolved not with destruction, but with simple indifference, if one day the giants decided to walk through the gates not out of hunger or rage, but curiosity. And the thought lingered as the hours passed and the city lights dimmed, until exhaustion finally pulled him into restless sleep, filled with images of towering silhouettes moving silently through empty streets, their footsteps echoing between buildings as though reclaiming something that had never truly been lost. And when morning came, it did not arrive gently, but with urgency, as alarms shattered the quiet before dawn, a sharp, insistent tone that cut through walls and dreams alike. And Armand jolted awake, his heart racing, as the automated voice repeated a message he had only heard in drills, not in reality, a message that carried a weight far heavier than any roar, because it spoke not of something beyond the fence, but within it. And as he rushed to the window, the city below was already in motion, vehicles halting, people gathering in controlled lines, gates sealing section by section, and then he saw it, far down the main transit corridor, where the reinforced road stretched toward the outer districts, a shape moving between the buildings, impossibly large, its silhouette unmistakable even at a distance, and for a moment the entire world seemed to hold its breath, because the boundary that had defined life for generations had just been crossed, not shattered with violence, but stepped over with quiet, undeniable certainty. And as the massive figure advanced slowly into the heart of the city, its presence casting long shadows across glass and steel, Armand realized that the fragile agreement he had come to understand the night before had changed forever. Not because humanity had failed to uphold it, but because something on the other side no longer saw a reason to keep it.
The streets did not erupt into chaos the way old disaster footage always showed. There was no screaming stampede or frantic collisions because generations had been raised with drills etched into their bones. And instead, the city moved with a strange, controlled urgency as barriers slid into place and civilians disappeared into reinforced structures. Yet beneath that order, something far more dangerous stirred, a quiet, collective disbelief that this was actually happening, that one of the giants had chosen to enter rather than remain beyond. And Armin felt it in himself as he raced down the stairwell. Not fear exactly, but a magnetic pull toward the impossible sight unfolding below. And when he emerged onto the lower levels, the air itself felt different, charged, heavy, as though the presence of the creature distorted not just space, but the rhythm of everything around it. And then he saw it clearly for the first time within the city, the Tyrannosaurus moving with a slow, deliberate grace along the wide transit road, its massive feet compressing the pavement with each step, leaving shallow impressions that would remain long after it passed. Its head angled slightly as it observed the towering structures on either side, reflective glass capturing fragments of its image in broken, shifting reflections that seemed almost unreal. And what struck Armin most was not its size, though it dwarfed everything, but its calm, the complete absence of agitation or aggression, as though it were simply passing through a landscape that happened to include human constructs rather than being confronted by them. And drones hovered at a cautious distance, projecting low-frequency signals meant to guide it back toward the perimeter, but the Rex did not react, its attention fixed forward, its movements steady and purposeful. And as it reached the central plaza, the heart of the city where roads converged and the largest structures rose, it slowed, its massive head lifting higher, nostrils flaring as it drew in the scent of something carried faintly on the morning air, something that seemed to anchor it in place for the first time since its arrival. And the silence that followed was deeper than any roar, a stillness so complete that even the hum of machinery seemed to fade. And Armin found himself stepping forward without realizing it, drawn by the same instinct that had held him in the clearing, his mind racing with the understanding that this was not random, that the creature had not wandered aimlessly into the city but had come for a reason. And then, from somewhere beyond the plaza, another sound rose, softer but unmistakable, a distant call that echoed faintly between the buildings. And the Rex responded, not with a roar, but with a low, resonant vibration that seemed to travel through the ground itself, a communication deeper than sound. And in that moment, everything shifted, because it became clear that this was not a solitary intrusion, but a connection, a thread linking the world inside the walls to the vast, unseen network beyond them. And as the echoes of that exchange faded, the Rex lowered its head again and turned, not back toward the forest, but deeper into the city, following something invisible yet undeniable. And Armin felt a sudden, chilling clarity settle over him, the realization that the boundary had not been crossed by accident or curiosity alone, but by necessity, that something had drawn this ancient giant into the human world with a purpose that could not be ignored or redirected. And as he stood there watching it move further between the buildings, its immense form weaving through structures that suddenly seemed fragile and temporary, he understood that whatever balance had once existed was not simply breaking, but evolving into something new, something neither side fully understood yet. And as the Rex disappeared into the maze of the city's inner sectors, leaving behind only the echo of its footsteps and the weight of its presence lingering in the air, Armin knew with a certainty that settled deep in his chest that this moment would not end with its departure, that it was the beginning of a change that would ripple outward far beyond this single city, reshaping the fragile coexistence that had defined their world into something far more unpredictable and far more dangerous, because for the first time, the giants were no longer content to remain unseen beyond the edge, and whatever had called them forward was still out there, waiting to be answered.
The authorities tried to regain control by flooding the inner sectors with signals, barriers, and carefully timed diversions, but the city had already shifted into something no protocol could fully contain, because the Tyrannosaurus did not behave like a threat that could be cornered or repelled. It moved with quiet certainty through streets that had never been designed for it, turning where it chose, pausing when it sensed something only it could perceive, and people watching from sealed windows and reinforced corridors began to understand that they were not witnessing an invasion, but a passage, something vast moving through their world with intent that had nothing to do with them. And Armin followed at a distance along elevated walkways, his path guided by glimpses of its immense form between buildings and the subtle tremor that marked each step. And as he moved deeper into parts of the city he had rarely seen, older districts where the architecture bore the marks of earlier adaptations to coexistence, he began to notice something strange in the infrastructure itself, patterns he had never paid attention to before, corridors left unusually wide, structures set back at odd angles, entire blocks that seemed intentionally sparse, as though the city had been shaped not just to keep the giants out, but to allow something to pass through if necessary. And the realization settled into him slowly, like a memory half forgotten, that perhaps this moment had not been entirely unforeseen, that somewhere in the past, long before his lifetime, there had been an understanding deeper than the current systems of control, an agreement not only of separation, but of occasional convergence. And as if responding to that hidden design, the Tyrannosaurus continued forward until the dense grid of buildings opened suddenly into a vast circular space at the city's core, a place Armin had only heard about in fragments, an abandoned central zone that had never been repurposed despite the city's constant expansion, its surface cracked and overgrown in places, its surrounding structures taller and more distant, creating an open sky above that felt almost unnatural within the urban landscape. And there the creature stopped completely, its massive body still for the first time since it had entered, its head lifting slowly as it released a deep, resonant call that rose into the open air and seemed to hang there, echoing outward beyond the city limits, beyond the forest, into distances no human ear could follow. And for several long moments nothing answered, the silence stretching until it became almost unbearable, until finally, faint and far away, another call emerged, then another, each one closer than the last, a chain of responses moving across the land like a wave returning to its source, and the ground beneath the city began to tremble again, not from the single presence of the wrecks, but from something far greater approaching, and Armin felt the magnitude of it before he saw anything, a collective movement beyond the horizon, countless massive bodies shifting through the wilderness in a unified direction, drawn by the same unseen force that had brought the first one here. And as the realization spread through the watching population, carried in hushed voices and widening eyes, the carefully maintained illusion of stability began to fracture, not into panic, but into something more profound, an awareness that the balance they had lived under was never static, but part of a larger rhythm they had only glimpsed, and now that rhythm was changing, accelerating, pulling both worlds toward a point of intersection that could no longer be avoided. And in the center of it all, the Tyrannosaurus remained motionless, a living axis around which everything seemed to turn, its presence no longer just that of a solitary giant, but a signal, a beacon calling others across vast distances. And as the distant tremors grew stronger, and the first shapes began to appear at the far edges of the city's perimeter, silhouettes emerging from the forest in numbers no one had ever witnessed before, Armin understood with a clarity that left no room for doubt that this was not the beginning of conflict, nor the end of coexistence, but something far more complex and irreversible, a convergence that would redefine both humanity and the ancient creatures they had lived beside for so long. And as the calls continued to echo across the open sky above the silent city, he realized that whatever had drawn them here was not something that could be stopped or redirected, because it was not driven
driven by hunger or territory or instinct alone, but by a deeper, older force that connected all living things in ways humanity was only beginning to comprehend. And in that moment, standing at the edge of the vast circular expanse, as the ground trembled with the approach of an entire prehistoric world, he knew that the story of their shared existence was not approaching its end, but its true beginning, one that would unfold not in the quiet separation they had known, but in the uncertain, unavoidable union that was now arriving with every thunderous step from beyond the horizon.
The first of the approaching giants crossed the outer perimeter just as the sun reached its highest point, their silhouettes resolving into distinct forms that moved with the same calm inevitability as the one that had called them, and yet each was different. Some longer and lower to the ground, with heavy armored backs that glinted in the harsh light, others towering on pillar-like legs with sweeping necks that carved slow arcs through the air, their presence transforming the distant skyline into something alive and shifting. And the city did not resist them, not because it lacked the means, but because resistance no longer made sense in the face of something that was not attacking, not even acknowledging the barriers as obstacles, simply stepping through the outer limits as though following a path that had always existed. And as they moved inward, their collective motion created a rhythm that pulsed through the streets, a synchronized progression that felt less like an invasion and more like a migration long delayed. And Armand stood at the edge of the central expanse as the original Rex lowered its head once more, releasing a second call, deeper this time, layered with something that resonated not just in the air, but within his chest. And the response from the others was immediate, a chorus that rose from every direction, converging toward this single point. And for a moment that seemed to stretch beyond time, the city became a meeting ground between eras, a place where the modern world and the ancient one did not clash, but overlapped, each revealing how incomplete it had been without the other. And as the nearest of the new arrivals entered the open space, their movements slowed, their heads turning toward the central figure, as though recognizing it not as a leader in the human sense, but as a focal point, a signal that had drawn them together. And Armand felt the air shift again, heavier now, charged with an energy that defied explanation. And then something even more unexpected happened, something no one had prepared for. The Rex in the center took a step forward and lowered its massive body, not in weakness, but in deliberate intention, pressing one side of its head gently against the cracked ground, its eye remaining open, watching, waiting. And one by one the others began to mirror the gesture, each lowering itself in its own way, forming a vast silent circle within the city's heart, their immense bodies creating a living boundary that enclosed the space completely. And the noise of the outside world seemed to vanish, replaced by a deep, continuous vibration that flowed between them, a communication that bypassed sound entirely. And as Armand watched, transfixed, he realized that this was not a gathering for movement or migration, but for something far more profound, something ritualistic in nature, a convergence driven by a shared instinct older than any single species. And at the very center of the circle, where the ground was most worn and fractured, the earth began to shift, subtly at first, then with increasing force, as cracks widened and fragments of stone lifted, as though something beneath the city itself was responding to their presence, and a low, resonant tone emerged from below, not produced by any creature, but by the planet itself. A sound that felt impossibly deep, reaching into layers of existence no human technology had ever touched. And the dinosaurs remained still as it grew stronger, their bodies acting as conduits for whatever was unfolding, their stillness amplifying the sense that this was not an event they were causing, but one they had come to witness and complete.
And Armand felt a sudden, overwhelming realization take hold, a truth that redefined everything he thought he understood about the world, that these creatures had not merely survived alongside humanity, but had always been part of a larger system, one that connected life to the very structure of the planet, and that the city, built unknowingly over this precise location, had become the stage for something that had been waiting for the right moment to awaken. And as the light from the fissure finally broke open with a slow, deliberate force, revealing a deep, glowing fissure that pulsed with the same rhythm as the calls that had summoned them, he understood that this was not the end of an era, nor the beginning of a conflict, but the unveiling of a truth that had been hidden beneath layers of time and progress, a truth that placed humanity not above or apart from the ancient giants, but alongside them as participants in something far greater. And as the light from the fissure illuminated the surrounding forms of the colossal creatures, casting shifting shadows across the silent city, Armand stood motionless at the edge of the impossible scene, knowing with absolute certainty that whatever emerged from that glowing depth would change not only the balance between species, but the very definition of what it meant to share a world that had never belonged to one alone. From within the glowing fissure, the light intensified until it cast sharp, trembling reflections across every surface of the silent city, and the deep vibration that had begun as a distant hum grew into a steady, resonant pulse that seemed to synchronize with the slow, measured breaths of the surrounding giants. And for a moment, Armand felt as though the entire world had aligned into a single rhythm, every movement, every sound, every heartbeat drawn into the same unseen current. And then the light shifted, not outward but upward, forming strands that rose like threads of molten gold, weaving together into shapes that flickered between solid and intangible. And the dinosaurs responded in unison, their bodies remaining lowered, but their heads tilting ever so slightly, eyes fixed on the emerging forms with a focus that was neither fear nor reverence, but recognition. And Armand realized with a jolt that this was not the first time such a convergence had occurred, that these creatures were not witnessing something unknown, but something remembered, an ancient cycle resurfacing in a world that had nearly forgotten it. And as the strands of light coalesced, they formed a vast shifting structure suspended above the fissure, a lattice of energy that pulsed with the same cadence as the calls that had summoned the giants. And within it, faint images began to appear, impressions of landscapes that did not match the present world, dense jungles stretching across continents, colossal shapes moving freely across open plains untouched by human hands, skies filled with unfamiliar patterns of life, all flickering like memories preserved in the very fabric of the planet. And Armand felt his breath catch as he understood that he was not simply seeing visions, but fragments of time itself, echoes of the world as it had existed when these creatures were not anomalies, but the dominant presence. And as the images intensified, overlapping and blending with the present surroundings, the boundaries between past and present seemed to blur, the towering buildings around the plaza dissolving momentarily into forests, roads fading into rivers, the city itself becoming transparent against the weight of what had come before. And yet the dinosaurs remained unchanged within it all, their forms steady, their presence constant, as though they existed outside the limitations of a single era, bridging time rather than belonging to it. And then the central Rex moved for the first time since the fissure had opened, lifting its head slowly and releasing a sound unlike any it had made before, a low, complex call that resonated not just through the air, but through the very light above, causing the lattice to shift and expand. And in response, the other giants began to rise as well, not fully, but enough to create a gradual collective motion that fed into the growing structure, their movements synchronized with a precision that suggested a purpose far beyond instinct. and Armin felt the ground beneath him stabilize even as the energy above intensified, as though the act of their gathering was not destabilizing the world, but restoring something within it. And the realization struck him with a clarity that left no room for doubt, that this was not a destructive event, but a reawakening, a process through which the planet itself was reconnecting with a part of its own history that had never truly disappeared, and humanity, for all its advancement, had simply built over it without understanding. And as the light continued to rise, reaching higher into the sky until it became visible far beyond the city limits, a beacon that stretched toward the horizon, Armin saw something within it begin to change, the shifting images slowing, focusing, converging into a single vast shape that seemed to exist both within the lattice and beyond it, a presence that dwarfed even the largest of the surrounding creatures, its outline indistinct yet undeniably real. And the reaction of the dinosaurs was immediate, their movement ceasing entirely as they turned toward it with a stillness that carried a weight of absolute recognition. And in that moment, the air itself seemed to pause, every vibration, every pulse, holding at the edge of something immense. And Armin understood that whatever was forming within that radiant structure was not merely a memory or an echo, but something active, something aware, something that had been called back into the world by the convergence of the giants. And as the shape within the light grew clearer, its presence pressing outward into reality with a force that made the very concept of scale feel meaningless, he realized that the boundary humanity had always believed existed between the known world and the ancient one was not a boundary at all, but a threshold, and that threshold had just been crossed in a way that could never be undone. And as the towering form within the lattice began to emerge fully into the open sky above the silent city, casting a shadow that stretched far beyond the horizon, Armin stood frozen at the edge of the transformed plaza, knowing that whatever came next would not simply redefine coexistence, but would reveal the true nature of the world they had been living in all along, a world far deeper, older, and more interconnected than anything humanity had ever imagined.
The colossal form did not descend all at once, but unfolded itself from the lattice of light in vast, deliberate motions, as though the sky were shedding a layer to reveal something that had always existed just beyond perception. And as it emerged, the brightness softened into a deep, living glow that illuminated every surface without casting harsh shadows, revealing details that had been hidden in the overwhelming radiance. And Armin could finally begin to comprehend its structure, not as a single creature in the way the dinosaurs were, but as a convergence of many forms, an immense shifting presence composed of interwoven shapes that echoed the anatomy of countless ancient beings, vast limbs that resembled pillars of bone and muscle, sweeping arcs like the necks of titanic herbivores, jagged contours that hinted at predatory origins, all blending seamlessly into something that transcended individual identity. And yet within that enormity, there was coherence, a singular awareness that radiated outward in a way that bypassed language entirely, pressing into the minds of everything beneath it with a quiet, undeniable clarity. And the dinosaurs responded not with movement, but with stillness so complete it felt absolute, their massive bodies grounded, their attention fixed entirely on the presence above, as though they were both acknowledging and sustaining it. And Armin felt that same awareness brush against him, not invasive or overwhelming, but impossibly vast, like standing at the edge of an ocean that was aware of every drop within it. And in that contact, understanding did not arrive as words, but as impressions, a cascade of meaning that unfolded faster than thought, revealing that this being was not an invader or a ruler, but a manifestation of something intrinsic to the planet itself, a living convergence of memory, evolution, and continuity, shaped by the countless lives that had moved across the world over uncounted ages. and the dinosaurs, rather than being separate from it, were integral to its existence, their long, unbroken presence acting as anchors that allowed this deeper layer of reality to persist even as the surface world changed. And humanity, for all its dominance, had never been part of that foundation until now. Not because it was excluded, but because it had not yet reached the point of awareness required to perceive it. And as this realization settled into him, Armin felt the boundaries of his understanding stretch, the rigid distinctions between past and present, nature and civilization dissolving into a single continuous flow. And he saw, not with his eyes, but with something deeper, how the world had always been in a state of balance far more complex than simple coexistence, a dynamic interplay between visible life and the underlying structure that sustained it, and how the arrival of humanity had disrupted that balance, not through destruction alone, but through disconnection, building systems that ignored the deeper rhythms rather than aligning with them. And now, through this convergence, that connection was being re-established, not by force, but by recognition. And as the immense presence above continued to unfold, its form stabilizing into something both alien and profoundly familiar, the dinosaurs began to rise slowly from their lowered positions, their movements synchronized once more, but this time directed not toward the center of the plaza, but outward, their bodies turning in unison as though responding to a new directive. And Armin understood that the gathering was complete, that whatever purpose had drawn them here had been fulfilled, and what came next would extend far beyond the boundaries of the city. And as the first of the giants began to move away from the circle, their steps carrying them back toward the edges of the urban landscape, there was no sense of retreat or withdrawal, only continuation, as though they were carrying something with them, something intangible yet profoundly real. And the presence above shifted as well, its vast form no longer confined to the space above the fissure, but expanding outward, diffusing into the sky until it became less a singular entity and more an omnipresent layer woven into the very atmosphere. And the light that had filled the plaza softened further, settling into the environment as a subtle, persistent glow that seemed to linger in every surface, every movement, every breath. And Armin stood at the edge of it all, watching as the city slowly re-emerged from its suspended state, systems reactivating, people stepping cautiously back into open spaces, their expressions reflecting the same quiet transformation he felt within himself. And in that shared silence, it became clear that what had occurred was not an ending or a beginning in the conventional sense, but a revelation, a moment in which the world had revealed its true nature to those willing to see it. And as the last of the great dinosaurs passed beyond the city's outer limits, their massive forms fading once more into the vast wilderness, the boundary that had once seemed so absolute no longer felt like a division at all, but a threshold that could be crossed in both directions, not through force or accident, but through understanding. And as Armin lifted his gaze to the sky, now calm and vast, yet subtly different in a way he could not fully describe, he knew with a certainty that would never leave him that humanity's place in this world had shifted forever, not above or below the ancient giants, but alongside them within a living system far greater than either could encompass alone. And that from this moment forward, every step taken, every city built, every choice made would carry the weight of that awareness, shaping a future where the line between the modern and the primordial no longer existed as a barrier, but as a connection that had finally, irrevocably been restored.
In the days that followed, the city did not return to what it had been, because the idea of before had quietly lost its meaning, replaced by a subtle but undeniable shift in how everything was perceived, as though a hidden layer of reality had been revealed and could no longer be ignored. And Armin noticed it first in the silence between sounds, in the way the air seemed fuller, carrying faint vibrations that had always been present but never consciously felt. And as he walked through streets that looked unchanged on the surface, he could sense a deeper continuity linking every structure, every living thing, every movement, a quiet awareness that lingered like the echo of the Great Convergence. And he was not alone in this, because people began to move differently, speak more softly, pause longer, their attention drawn not only to each other, but to the spaces between, to the unseen currents that now felt as real as the ground beneath their feet. And beyond the city, reports spread of similar phenomena unfolding across the world, not in dramatic displays, but in gradual, unmistakable ways. Herds altering their migration paths with new precision, forests growing denser in patterns that aligned with ancient routes long forgotten, even the oceans reflecting changes in movement that defied previous understanding. And it became clear that what had been awakened in that central plaza had not remained there, but had extended outward, reweaving the connections between all living systems on a global scale. And humanity, for the first time, found itself responding rather than directing, adapting its structures not to control or contain, but to align, reshaping cities with corridors that mirrored natural flows, redesigning technology to harmonize with the subtle rhythms now perceptible to those who paid attention. And Armin found himself drawn back again and again to the place where it had begun, the once abandoned central expanse now transformed into something impossible to define, neither urban nor wild, but a convergence of both, where the ground still bore the faint trace of the fissure, now closed yet pulsing with a soft, steady glow that never faded. And people came there not out of fear or curiosity, but out of a quiet need to feel connected to whatever had been revealed, standing in silence as though listening to something just beyond the reach of ordinary senses. And on one such evening, as the light of the setting sun blended with the subtle radiance of the ground, Armin felt that familiar vibration return, stronger than before. And when he lifted his gaze toward the horizon, he saw them again, distant but unmistakable, the silhouettes of the giants moving along the edge of the world, not approaching the city, but passing near it, their presence steady, their paths deliberate. And this time there was no alarm, no urgency, only a shared awareness that their movement was part of something ongoing, something that no longer required separation or intervention. And as one of the distant figures paused briefly, its massive head turning slightly toward the city before continuing on, Armin felt a quiet understanding settle within him, that the connection established during the convergence had not been temporary, that it persisted in ways both subtle and profound, linking human and dinosaur, present and past, surface and depth into a single evolving whole. And as the last light of day faded and the city's glow rose to meet the darkening sky, he realized that the world had not become something entirely new, but had revealed what it had always been, a living, interconnected system in which every existence, no matter how small or immense, played a role in maintaining a balance that could never be owned or dominated, only understood and respected. And as he stood there, no longer at the edge of two worlds, but within one continuous reality, he felt neither fear nor uncertainty, but a quiet, enduring sense of belonging, knowing that whatever changes lay ahead would not divide the world further, but draw it closer together, guided not by control or conflict, but by the same deep, unspoken harmony that had finally, after ages of separation, been heard once more.
And yet, even in this seemingly perfected harmony, there remained edges of mystery that no generation could fully dissolve, because the world that had revealed itself during the convergence was not a finished truth, but a living system still in motion, still capable of change in ways no one could predict. And Armin sensed it first not through sight or sound, but through a subtle absence, a thinning of that familiar planetary rhythm that had become like background awareness in his later life, as if something vast had briefly stepped outside the shared pattern, and the giants in the distance began to respond in ways that were different from before, their movements slowing, their coordinated paths breaking into irregular pauses as they gathered along the farthest corridors of the wilderness. And the younger observers in the city noticed it too, though they did not yet have words for what they were feeling, only a growing sense that the balance itself was adjusting once again, not collapsing, not breaking, but recalibrating. And Armin found himself walking farther than he had in years, moving beyond the familiar edges of the city into the open transitional zones where human design faded completely into natural terrain, until he reached one of the ancient observation ridges that overlooked the vast expanse where forests met plains and rivers cut long silver scars through the land. And there he saw them more clearly than he had in decades, the great herd-like formations of massive creatures gathered in wide, silent assemblies, not migrating, not feeding, but waiting. And above them, the air itself seemed altered, carrying that same layered vibration he remembered from the first emergence, but now it was fractured, as if the underlying signal had been split into multiple competing harmonics. And then, on the farthest edge of the horizon, something new appeared. Not another dinosaur, not another echo of the ancient world he had come to know, but a disturbance in the land itself, a rising of terrain where none had been before, as if the earth were gently folding upward into unfamiliar shapes. And the giants reacted immediately, their heads turning in unison toward it, their calls rising not in alarm, but in recognition that carried a weight Armin had never heard before, a tone that suggested not threat, but transformation. And as the land continued to shift, revealing structures that were neither natural nor human, something vast and geometric, emerging from beneath layers of soil and stone that had never been disturbed in recorded history, Armin felt the understanding he had built over a lifetime begin to stretch beyond its limits, because this was not part of the harmony he had come to believe in, not an extension of the living system he thought he understood, but something adjacent to it, something that had been dormant or hidden or waiting in a way that mirrored the emergence they had once witnessed beneath the city. And the dinosaurs began to move again, slowly at first, then with increasing coordination, forming wide arcs around the rising structures as if encircling a point of convergence. And for the first time since the original event, Armin felt a return of that deep, ancient uncertainty, not fear exactly, but the awareness that the world was larger still than what had been revealed, and that the balance between all things was not a fixed harmony, but an ongoing negotiation between forces that could surface at any time. And as the geometric forms continued to rise into full view, casting unfamiliar shadows across the land and subtly altering the very way light moved through the air, he realized that the story of coexistence between humanity and the giants was no longer the only story unfolding on the planet, because beneath and beyond even that relationship, deeper layers of reality were still awakening, and whatever had now begun to emerge was responding not only to the presence of dinosaurs or humans, but to the same underlying structure that had called them all into alignment before. And as the giants halted their movements once more, forming a vast, silent perimeter around the impossible intrusion, Armin stood on the ridge, feeling the world expand in meaning yet again, understanding that the harmony he had come to trust was not an endpoint, but a fragile, evolving state within something infinitely larger. And as the rising structures finally broke fully through the surface and began to stabilize in the open air, he knew that whatever came next would demand a new kind of understanding entirely, one that neither the ancient giants nor humanity alone could yet fully comprehend, but which both would have to face together as the world continued its endless process of becoming.
Time, in the years that followed, stopped feeling like a straight line and began to resemble something more like a slow, unfolding pattern, as if the world itself was learning how to breathe in a new rhythm. And Armin, now old enough that his movements carried the careful weight of memory, often found himself sitting at the edge of the central expanse where it had all changed, watching as the light shifted across the living surface beneath him, subtle pulses traveling through the ground like distant heartbeats, and the city beyond no longer felt separate from the wilderness, because the two had grown into each other in quiet, irreversible ways, not by conquest or collapse, but by gradual alignment, as if the world had decided that division was no longer necessary. And in the far distance, the great corridors of open land stretched endlessly, through which the giants still moved, not in constant presence, but in seasonal rhythms that had become as familiar as weather. And people no longer reacted to their passing with fear or astonishment, but with a deep, practiced awareness, stepping aside when needed, pausing when the ground trembled, listening when the air changed in tone. And over time, even language adapted, words emerging that had no meaning before the convergence, terms for vibrations in the earth, for distant calls carried through terrain, for the subtle changes in atmosphere that preceded movement of immense bodies across the land. And Armin had once tried to explain to a younger generation what it had been like before, when the world felt divided into categories of safe and dangerous, known and unknown. But he found that the words no longer held weight for them, because they had never experienced separation in the way he had. And so he stopped trying, realizing that understanding could not be passed down as a memory, but only lived as a presence. And one evening, as he sat alone and the sky deepened into a familiar gradient of gold and indigo, he felt it again, not as an alarm or a disruption, but as a gentle resonance beneath the surface of everything, a shift in the shared rhythm that told him something distant was changing. And he rose slowly, following that sensation without urgency, moving through streets that now seemed almost like pathways within a larger organism rather than a constructed grid, until he reached the outer edge where the city dissolved into the open landscape. And there, beyond the softened boundary, he saw movement on the horizon, not a single shape, but many, spreading across the land in a wide, coordinated flow. And as they approached, he recognized the patterns immediately, the alternating forms, the shifting heights, the way the ground responded in waves beneath their passage. And he understood that this was not an intrusion or an event, but a return of a cycle that had always existed. And as the first of the giants emerged into view, the Tyrannosaurus among them moving with the same steady certainty he remembered from decades before, he felt no surprise, only a deep and quiet affirmation that nothing essential had changed since the day of convergence, only deepened. And as the massive creatures passed along the outer edge of the city, their presence once again weaving through the familiar corridors of land and light, Armin remained still, not as an observer of something extraordinary, but as a participant in something continuous, something that had never required explanation to be real. And in that final recognition, as the world moved around him in its vast, living rhythm, he understood that there had never been a moment when dinosaurs like Tyrannosaurus rex were separate from the story of the Earth, and there would never be a moment when that story ended, only transformed, endlessly, within the same ancient, breathing whole.
Years passed without the world ever slipping back into the illusion it once held, and what had begun as a single, incomprehensible event gradually revealed itself as an ongoing transformation that unfolded not in sudden upheavals, but in a steady, deliberate deepening of awareness. And Armin, older now, found that the memory of that first encounter in the clearing no longer felt like the beginning of something, but like the moment he had first opened his eyes to what had always been there. And the city around him had changed in ways both visible and invisible, its architecture flowing more organically, its boundaries softer, its relationship with the surrounding wilderness no longer defined by defense but by integration, as corridors of open land extended outward, allowing the passage of great creatures without disruption. And in turn, the giants moved through these spaces with the same quiet purpose they had shown on the day of convergence, never lingering unnecessarily, never causing harm, their presence now a recognized and even anticipated part of the world's rhythm. And children grew up not with stories of fear or dominance, but with an understanding that their existence was intertwined with forces far greater than themselves, learning to listen as much as to speak, to observe as much as to act. And Armand often returned to the central expanse, which had become a place of reflection rather than spectacle, its surface now covered in a thin layer of living growth that pulsed faintly with the same energy he had felt on that day. And though the fissure itself had sealed, the connection it had revealed remained, a quiet gateway not of passage, but of perception. And on one such visit, as the sky stretched clear and endless above him, he felt a familiar vibration rise once more, not as strong as before, but unmistakable. And when he looked out toward the distant horizon, he saw a single figure emerging from the wilderness, moving slowly along one of the great corridors that now linked the city to the vast lands beyond. And even from afar, he recognized the shape, the measured steps, the presence that had first crossed the boundary so many years ago. And as it approached, there was no alarm, no tension, only a calm acknowledgement that this meeting, like the one before, was part of an ongoing dialogue between worlds that were no longer separate. And when the Tyrannosaurus reached the edge of the expanse, it paused, its massive form outlined against the open sky, and for a long moment nothing moved, the air itself holding still as though in quiet recognition of the significance of the encounter. And then, slowly, the creature stepped forward into the space, its gaze sweeping across the surroundings before settling briefly on Armand. And in that glance, there was no mystery left, no barrier of incomprehension, only a shared awareness that transcended the need for language, a mutual understanding that both had witnessed the same transformation, both had become part of the same evolving balance. And the Rex lowered its head slightly, not in submission or dominance, but in simple acknowledgement. And Armand felt an instinctive response rise within him, a quiet inclination to mirror the gesture, and as he did, the moment stretched into something profound yet unspoken, a recognition that bridged the vast difference between them. And after a time that could not be measured, the creature lifted its head once more and turned, its path carrying it back toward the open land, its departure as calm and deliberate as its arrival. And Armand remained where he stood, watching until the immense figure faded into the distance, and as it disappeared beyond the horizon, he felt no sense of ending, no finality, only continuity, a quiet certainty that this connection, once revealed, would never be lost again. And as the light of the setting sun spread across the transformed city and the endless wilderness beyond, blending them into a single, seamless landscape, he understood that the world had not been reshaped into something unfamiliar, but had finally become whole, its ancient and modern aspects no longer in opposition, but in harmony. And in that harmony, the true story of their existence continued, not as a struggle for dominance or survival, but as a shared journey within a living system that had always been vast enough to hold them all, a journey that would unfold across generations yet to come, guided by the same quiet understanding that had brought them together. And as Armand turned away from the open expanse and began to walk back toward the life that awaited him, he carried with him not the memory of a single extraordinary day, but the enduring awareness that he was part of something far greater than himself, something timeless, something alive, and that in that vast, interconnected world, every step forward was not a departure from the past, but a continuation of a story that had never truly been divided at all.